So, good morning. No, good afternoon, guys. This is my first time to do this video lecture with you. And our topic for today is about conscience. If you're going to look at your screen, I'll be presenting with you the PowerPoint of our discussion. And this is on lesson 6 about human conscience and discernment. Okay, so let's look at this. What is conscience? What is most of us would say that it is the voice within. It is a voice within. It is something that tells you what to do or not to do. Some people would say, or some of you would believe that conscience is the voice of God or the police. Watch and stop you from what you want to do. What's it? What's it's really about? We are in class. You are supposed to do this activity. I would have to divide how conscience works. You have to dramatize how conscience work during examination and also in human relationships. And perhaps when it comes to human relationships, cheating will always be a spicy story when it comes to conscience. But since we have no contact, we will not do this anymore. Now, for the discussion of conscience, if you study psychology, it is very much related, or somehow it could be seen like in terms of the super ego. What is a super ego? Well, of course, in theology, conscience is not the super ego, but oftentimes uh, we associate it with super ego. Our super ego seems to be our conscience, but it is not. Sigmund Freud, a very famous psychologist, developed this notion that there are three structures of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. What is the id? Id is the pleasure principle. Okay? Kung ano ang gusto mo, sundin mo. No? Whatever pleases you, whatever makes you comfortable, whatever suits your appetite, what gives you pleasure, maybe food, sex, whatever, even good things that's pleasurable for you, like a stroll in the park or swimming in the beach, no beach, and eating food that gives pleasure. So that's id. Now, ego, on the other hand, is your conscious self. Your conscious self. That is something that would somehow police your pleasure principle. Like you would say, well, this may be pleasurable for me, but is it good for me? Uh, it is already uninformed. Well, something that would say that would balance, that we are not like animals, that we just do whatever we want. Because we have this consciousness that there are things that are not helpful, or that there are things that are not really good for us. And then there's the super ego. Okay? Super ego. I will discuss what super ego is later. Sometimes super ego is confused with the person's conscience. Why? What is super ego? Let me just move this here. Super ego is like a tape, hmm, that we have in our head, playing the do's and don'ts that we have learned from authority figures when we were growing up. Huwag mong gawin yan. Hindi mo dapat gawin yan. Masama yan. That keeps on playing in our mind. The commands of the superego came from the process of absorbing the regulations and restrictions of those who are our sources of love and approval, like our parents or grandparents. A significant authority figure that is the person's source of love and approval. It is internalized as the voice of the superego. Most of the time, it's our parents, okay? The significant persons in our life that keeps on, it's like embedded already in our being, because this was said to us when we were young. It plays like music in our ears, like a policeman that would control us of the do's and don'ts of things. Superego is basically a principle of self-censorship that and controls the uses of superego guilt. So it's based on the fear of losing the right to be loved. Okay, the right to be loved. We dread that. That's why we have to follow it. If we're going to follow it, there's this certain feeling like we might lose their love for us. It's a means to keep the person obedient to self-imposed rules. This has become a self-imposed rules. Even if our parents are no longer around, or even if those people who have inculcated these rules in our mind and our heart, we keep on following it. It's like an instinct within us. We feel like if we're not going to do it, we are unlovable, that it isn't unacceptable, that it is something that is dreadful, that it is something that would make us unlikable. Okay? Superego and moral guilt. Superego guilt is introverted because it is concerned about the love that has lost. Feel guilt out of our superego. There is this need for us to regain what was lost. We feel guilty of doing things that we thought are bad, but our motivation is because we have lost. It seems that we have lost that love and we need to regain it. So we feel guilty by doing it. So there's a need, the strong feeling to get back, to make it right. The moral guilt of a mature conscience, on the other hand, is extroverted sa labas, no? And is concerned about the welfare of others who have been hurt by one's actions and how one's offense has weakened or damaged one's loving relationship with God and with others. See the difference of the two? Superego guilt is introverted within. No? We feel guilty because of a personal need to regain what was lost, that love. We feel that by doing this act, we have lost that the worth to be loved. So it's introverted, it's within. On the other hand, moral guilt of a mature conscience is more of an extroverted. It's a focus on other person. Like, I feel guilty for doing this because I have hurt another person. I have hurt God. I have hurt my parents. I have hurt my friends. I have hurt the people around me. So the guilt is coming uh, from the outside, like the feel to regain, not regain, but the feeling of needing to do it right, to make it right, for the sake of others. No? It's not it's not about you. It's not about your feeling about needing to be wanted again or needing to be loved again, but the motivation and the idea here of a mature conscience is that you have hurt another person and you need to amend that. How the superego works. When a superego controls the person who does something that his or her superego prohibits, the superego induces a sense of panic in the person by making the person feel guilty that love would be withdrawn from him because of her guilty. You panic because you fear that you will lose that love. They will not love you anymore. You will not be important anymore. The person feels isolated from the source of love, and the superego will induce the person to correct the violation and regain the love it feels it has lost. The superego controlled person will seek to escape or remove his or her isolation in three ways. One, unconscious betrayal of guilt. What is that? They try to hide their violation, unconsciously seek to be discovered so that reconciliation and restoration of love would take place. See that see that contradiction, no? That person will try to hide it, but deep inside, he wants it to be discovered. Okay, so that reconciliation will take place. That's unconscious betrayal of guilt. Second is seek some indirect punishment. Parusahan ang sarili. No? Punishment is associated with reconciliation and restoration of love. Because I have done something wrong, I have to punish myself. Okay? To punish myself. I disobeyed my parents. I feel so bad. I need to punish myself. Hindi ako lalabas ng kwarto, hindi ako lalabas ng bahay. Magdadrama ako. Kaya suicidal ako ngayon because I am so bad. I don't deserve your love. Mga ganyang drama. No? Indirect punishment. Third is the person will seek an indirect escape from isolation by creating a community where the person would be accepted. Ayun. Indirect escape from his isolation by creating a new community where he will be or she will be accepted. It implies provoking others to deeds similar to one's own. Like, masama talaga ako, no? Talagang ganito na ako. Mabisyo ako. So, these people will try to look for people with the same, not values, but vices and try to compensate that need for love and approval with that. So that's how they escape their isolation. The isolation created by doing something that their superego tells them that is bad. Superego is a primitive phase in development of a mature conscience. It starts from our childhood. So imagine your choices based on external rules. Like, well, you cannot play Barbie. If you're a boy, you cannot play Barbie. So those are external rules. Why? It's in our mind. No? When we grow old, boys cannot play Barbie. No? They cannot play it. Those are external rules. Now, from adulthood, it now develops into a conscience where we integrate the rules we have learned from our significant authority figures with our own understanding of the values behind these rules and our vision of what kind of person we want to be in the future. Now, when we grow up, we try to understand what we learned from childhood. Why were these rules implemented? No? Because when we were a child, we just follow. We don't normally understand why things are prohibited or why are there certain rules. We just obey because we are a child. But when we grow up, we must try to understand why these rules were implemented so that they will become values for us. Understand that these things are made rules because it is to protect us from harming ourselves, or that these were implemented so that we will enjoy life more. Let the superego organically develop into a mature conscience. That is our challenge. That from the superego, it becomes a mature conscience. No? Not superego is a selfish thing. You wanted to change or you wanted to amend, you wanted to correct what you have done based on the fear of being unloved. That is a superego guilt. It is not what Christian conscience is. Christian's conscience is more on, it is more focused on because you have hurt another person. That's why you want to correct it. Some persons do not go beyond the superego state of moral development and they confuse the superego as their conscience and the voice of the superego as the voice of God. This is something that is terrible but true. Many people are like this. They confuse the superego with the voice of God. That's why they find God as something who punishes, someone who's just waiting for us to commit mistakes and then punish us. We confuse God with that, our conscience with that. But Actually, it is our superego speaking to us, not our conscience. Now, during transition from superego to conscience, we may continue to hear the voice of the superego in the background. Uh, it's not easy to let go of that. Development of mature conscience does not mean a total silencing of the superego. Well, of course, due to our childhood memories, you cannot just shut it out completely. Okay? Hindi mo pwede sabihin, ay, superego to, superego. You need to strike a balance, no? And see what is valuable for you. Desirable. We can identify whether the voice we are hearing on a particular moral matter is our superego or our conscience, and that we choose to listen to our conscience. Choose to listen to our conscience, not to our superego. Well, some problems from confusion between conscience and superego. One, again, the distorted image of God. Children were taught that conscience is the voice of God. Superego is the voice of God, leads to a formation of a distorted image of God. What is that distorted image of God again? A God that is easily offended by the breaking of the rules. A God that uses guilt as a means to discipline an offender. And a God that punishes or is appeased by self imposed punishment. We see God as a punisher, as a giver of rules. And then when we disobeyed, punishment awaits us. That is a distorted image of God and conscience. No? If we know that our conscience is the voice of God and that it tells us that, oh, nako, you did something wrong again, wait for the punishment. Mistaken perception that a person can fluctuate between sin and grace. No? Pwede kang mag pwede kang mag-shift from being in a state of grace into a state of sin. Or from being very sinful, bigla kang magiging state of grace. It's a mistake. It's like a back and forth movement from being punished and then forgiven by an authority. Shifts between sin and grace. Storm and sunshine understanding of sin. What is that? It's like that sin is okay, you have committed something and then you just wash it away and it's already okay. No, it's like it's that easy. It's a misconception also of confession. Like, okay, I will just go to confession, tell the priest my sins, and then after that, I'm all white again. Or I'm all clear again. I'm all good again. That is wrong because our state of sin tells us that we need to do something in order to get out of that situation. It is not just something that we washed away. It is something that we should understand. Why in the first place we end up in that situation and what are we going to do to move out of it? To move out of it. Okay? It's not just breaking the rules, but knowing why you broke the rules and why you should value uh, what it is teaching us. It's a distorted understanding of confession. A confessor does not distinguish conscience and superego, will reinforce storm and sunshine perception of sin and grace by focusing only on sinful acts to do. I cheated, I masturbated, I looked at pornography, I viewed pornography, I shouted at my mother, I said bad words, etc., etc. If you will just be focused on that and then confessing it and then thinking that, okay, it's done, at least I have said it already in confession to a priest, then that's it. It's super ego speaking, just telling you the do's and don'ts. But conscience is something different. If the confessor focuses on the sinful acts only and does not direct the penitent toward formation of mature conscience and growth in character, the confessor will not enable the penitent to break through sinful patterns. When we go to confession, we do not just focus on the punishment. No? Like for your penance, you pray our three Our Fathers, three Hail Marys, one Glory be. That is not the focus of confession. The focus is the priest should help us amend our life, give us advice how we can move out of that situation. Confession will become a convenient way to attain punishment and reconciliation, not because of the sincere desire for conversion and renewal. You will just make confession like a washing machine. You just go there, wash yourself. There is no true conversion. The next month, same sin again. The next month, same sin again. Like you're going to confession na para madali nilang, Father, pareho lang din nung last month. Father, pareho lang din nung the previous months. If you keep on doing the same sins all over and over and over and over again, there must be something wrong. At least struggle, no, and not commit new sins, but at least try to see why you're committing the same sins all over again. Perhaps there must be something wrong with your conversion. There is no conversion. A person who goes to confession repeatedly for the same sins and are not helped to grow in their relationship with God will find confession to be ineffective for their moral growth. Hindi ka rin mag-grow. They will eventually lessen the frequency of confession and will go only if they are moved by unbearable overemphasis on acts and following rules. Superego focuses on the offenses that violate the prohibition of the superego. Superego following rules. Yeah. Moral guilt is concerned about the weakening of one's loving relationship with God and others. It's a focus of moral guilt, no, of conscience. Yung paghina ng iyong loving relationship with other people and with God. It is focused not on the loss of love caused by the offenses, but on the negative consequences of one's sinful choices to the welfare of others and the community, and negative effects on the direction of one's life and the development of one's character. See the difference ng superego and conscience? Superego is more selfish. No? Like, they will not love me anymore. But conscience is more others direct. I have destroyed my relationship with others and with God. And that's what I want to amend. That's why I want to change. Because I am destroying or cutting this relationship, my relationship with others. I have hurt them. I have hurt them. Ako, learning activity, we do not have the learning activity. No? Uh, I would have asked some of the do's and don'ts in your life and then try to check, is this a super ego conscience or is this a mature conscience? According to Gaudium et Spes number 16 about conscience, in the depths of his conscience, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience, always summoning him to love the good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of man. There is alone with God. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his steps. In a wonderful manner, conscience reveals that law which is fulfilled by love of God and neighbor. In fidelity to conscience, Christians are joined with the rest of man in the search for truth and for the genuine solution of the numerous problems which arise in the life of individuals from social relationships. Hence, the more right conscience holds sway, the more persons and groups turn aside from blind choice and strive to be guided by the objective norms of morality. What does this mean? It's the primacy of conscience. This is very, very strong in moral theology, my dear students. When you face moral choices, the church would not impose her rules on you and will always say primacy of your conscience, because at the end of the day, it will be between you and your God. Our situations are always um, specific, tailored towards our life. Our choices, our moral choices, are affected by many little circumstances in our life. And the church teaches through this document, Gaudium et Spes, would tell us that your conscience will be the judge. What is God telling you in your heart? What is God telling you in your heart? That is the primacy of conscience. If it is contrary to what seems to be a general rule, as long as you follow your conscience, then that must be right. But there is something that we call uninformed conscience. So there are callous conscience, like wala nang kaluluwa naman din talaga, wala nang taong mga walang konsensya. You should also inform your conscience. Conscience is developed, like what I mentioned earlier. No? There's a transition from superego to conscience when you already learn the value of things, what is good and what is right for you, no, and for others. So that's how conscience works. What we learn from Gaudium et Spes, they use the metaphor of sanctuary to describe conscience. No? Conscience is a holy and sacred space. Conscience is a safe place for you, where people encounter of the person with God in his moral discernment and his response to what believes to be God's voice to him in her depths of one's conscience. It's the voice of God. Conscience is not the voice of God. Conscience is not the voice of God. Why? It is where we hear the voice of God. Ayun. Conscience is not the voice of God, but it is where we hear the voice of God. Discern and decide on our moral response to God and evaluate our past actions to improve our future response. It is a sanctuary. It is a place where we meet God, okay? Where we hear His voice. We exercise our conscience within a community and we need the help of our community. Or activities of conscience. Oops, sorry. Or activities of conscience. Conscience directs us to listen to God, seek the truth of God. Our conscience enables us to know what good we should do and what evil we should avoid. Our conscience judges whether a plan of action is good or bad. And our conscience evaluates past actions if they are still correct or if they are wrong. It's a discernment. Okay? And we grow in it. We grow in conscience. Okay? We mature in it because we learn from our experience. We learn from our experience and we learn to value things. As we go along life, our values become more intact. Those that are not really important, those that are not really meaningful, becomes less and less in our life. And in our conscience, we learn what is really important. Three sense of our conscience. One, conscience as a capacity. Synderesis. Hindi yan Cinderella. It's synderesis. Capacity, tendency within us to know and to do the good. It's a capacity to do the good. Involves our general sense of value and fundamental sense of responsibility, which makes it possible for us to engage in moral discussions or to determine the particular moral good. Conscience is a process of discovering the particular good which ought to be done or evil to be avoided. It involves seeking to understand universal moral norm and applying them to particular cases. Discovering exemptions and new norms in response to extraordinary situations. And it formed and informed through experience, as I have said. Our conscience is formed by our experiences. Conscience as judgment. Well, specific judgments of good which I must do. It helps you decide what must I do. Primary object of this judgment is not this or that object or choice, but being this or that sort of person through what I choose. Do you understand what does mean? What does it mean? If I do this, what does it make of me? If I choose this, tell about me. Who am I? It speaks about who you are. It will speak about who you are, what you value, how you choose. It will tell who you are, what kind of a person you are. This is the conscience I must obey to be true to myself. This is the sanctuary of the self, which must never be violated. But of course, conscience must be formed. Okay? Some of us have callous conscience. Wala nang konsensya. Parang hindi na nagsasalita ang saloobin sa atin. So, there must be formation of conscience. Our moral obligation is to form our conscience. Obligation to follow conscience presupposes that we must have properly formed it. One, forming conscience is a process of conversion and lifelong task. It's not a one big shot deal. No? You form yourself as you grow old. No? It's a process of conversion. You change your mind. It's metanoia. No? Judgment made for oneself. What must I do? But not by oneself. What does that mean? That leads to a firm communal social aspect of conscience. No? You do not just judge based from what you must do, but you also base it on uh, how will this affect others? How will this affect others? Yung bahala kayo. Buhay ko to, kung ano lang yung mabuti sa akin, yun lang ang gagawin. Our conscience involves the welfare of other people. Vatican II would say, what with others mean, yung pag-form ng conscience. With your family, with the church, and with society. Through prayer and reflection on the life and teachings of Christ, we form our conscience by studying what would Jesus do, studying his life and his teachings. Primary consideration to the teachings of the magisterium. What did the church say? I think our default is the church would not say things that just for the sake of implementing rules, but it has been discerned, thought of, and deemed to be for the good of the soul. So let us not always be critical about the church teachings because, in the first place, it was made for our good, inspired by the values of the community. What are the values of your community? It will help form your conscience by being open to dialogue with others. Ang hirap kasi sa atin ngayon, we do not know how to engage in dialogue. Fostering human religious values in one's life. Have some religious values. It's not bad. Constantly aware of our human capacity to make rationalizations for our action. Lagi tayong nagra-rationalize. We always have that. Minsan palusot. 10. Realize the need of the help of others in discerning what right action to choose. No, it's not always. We do not know everything always. No, sometimes it's good to discern with other people. Seek the advice of other people who are more mature than ourselves. There's wisdom in that. 11. With others in search for truth. Also in discerning, informing our conscience, we journey with others who are also searching for truth. The primacy of conscience in Dignitatis Humanae number 16. In all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God, the end and purpose of life. He is not to be forced to act in manner contrary to his conscience. See, you are not to act. Your conscience is telling you. One must always follow one's informed conscience. Thomas Aquinas maintains that one sins if one does not follow one's conscience. It is better to risk excommunication rather than violate one's conscience. What does that mean? He was saying it is better kapag minsan hindi ka mag-o-obey sa simbahan because you're following your conscience. Now, making erroneous judgment, yung mga maling paghuhusga naman, no? A human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. If he were deliberately to act, he would condemn himself. Yet it can happen that moral conscience remains in ignorance and makes erroneous judgments performed already committed. Minsan kasi naman, mali. We grew up because it is taught. No? Values is also taught. Minsan hindi natin alam na mali pala kasi lumaki tayong ganun. Lumaki ka sa environment na palamura. No? People are always cursing and then you just find yourself not seeing the fault in it. Persons could make wrong choices. Persons can get wrong information, bad influence, wrong images of God, wrong values. People may not be aware that his conscience is erroneous. So if a person sincerely follows his erroneous conscience, does he commit sin? Well, there's something that we call vincible ignorance. This ignorance can often be imputed to personal responsibility. This is the case when a man takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by decrease almost blinded to the habit of committing sin. In such cases, the person is culpable for the evil he commits. Invincible ignorance is the ignorance or invincible or the moral subject is not responsible for his erroneous judgment. The evil committed by the person cannot be imputed to him. It remains no less an evil, a privation, a disorder. One must therefore work to correct the errors of moral conscience. You need to correct it. There's a need to be formed. Not responsible for his errors and is not a fault. There is no sin. Okay, there is no sin. Okay, there is no sin because of ignorance. He doesn't know. He doesn't know, but it needs to be formed. If a person realizes that he did something wrong because of invincible ignorance, he must correct his error and make restitution. Now, dealing with people who have erroneous conscience. In general, we should respect the conscience of every person. If you disagree with the person, try to persuade the person to change his mind, his choices. If a person's conscience choice will lead to greater harm to self, others, or the community, we may have to prevent the person from following his conscience choice. No? Hindi naman pwedeng, sinasabi ng konsensya ko, patayin kita eh. So, well, it's obviously an erroneous conscience. You need to stop that. Like attempted suicide. My conscience is telling me that I have to end my life. Well, you need to stop that. Another is improper sexual activity. Well, my conscience tells me that it is normal. Good conscience urges us to present a person to prevent a person from causing harm. Kapag masasaktan ka or makakasakit ka, well, we need to correct that. Conscience and sin. A person commits sin when he does not follow the good judgment of his conscience and chooses the bad because of selfishness. If he tries his best to form his conscience and follow it, he is more able to avoid the temptations of sin. If a person has weak conscience and not used to listening to God, he is more likely to be tempted to sin. Even if we commit sin, God will still continue to speak to our conscience and urge us to repent. He'll still urge us to repent. A person who forms his conscience knows that he will never lose God's love, even if he falls into sin. That is true. The person with a good conscience feels guilt and true repentance for his sins, but he is not afraid of losing God's love. A person with good conscience is aware that even if he has sinned, God desires reconciliation rather than punishment. See, a good conscience will tell us to change because we want to restore that relationship with God. Not that because we are afraid of punishment, but because we love God, we love that person, and we not want to amend the things that we did wrong. A sinner with conscience will try to repair the damage he has done not because he wants to avoid punishment, but because it is just and right thing to do. Okay, I think we'll end there. There's a case study that will be your assignment, and I will give that to you. So again, thank you for listening. I hope you learned a thing or two.